Hello, and welcome back to Human Evolution. Today I want to talk about the more modern hominins, and sometimes we consider these to be the last humans. We, of course, are not the only one, and just to review, we talked about some of the major traits. We have the bipedalism is the first really important trait for hominid evolution. Then we start out with the small brain, really large teeth, no stone tools, and as we go forward in time, we find out that the brains start to get bigger, we get variation in skulls, variations in teeth, we start having tools, we start having hunters, we get bigger and bigger brains, we get fire, we start migrating out until we finally get to the last of the humans, so us, for instance. Okay, and here's just another picture of this. I thought you might find it helpful. So here's your first question. Homo erectus is in our direct lineage, true or false? Well, we know from some of our other conversations that Homo erectus is not in our direct lineage, and so what we are going to do is we are going to start our last humans with Homo heidelbergensis. Homo heidelbergensis lived from 800,000 to about 300,000, maybe 200,000 years ago, and had a large brain, was part of the Acheulean tool industry, which we've talked about before, probably descended from Homo ergaster, which some people consider to be early Homo erectus, but it is pretty much agreed upon that Homo ergaster is a different species than later the Homo erectus, right? And so, evolved in Africa, spreads out, right? Homo heidelbergensis is the first species to migrate out, probably because of drought and geographical conditions that actually allowed for them to walk out, right? And so we find Homo heidelbergensis all over the place. We actually find Homo heidelbergensis in the same places that we find Homo erectus, and so they actually both migrated out, and they might have migrated out around the same time. Now, the next of the last humans to evolve is Homo neanderthalensis, and these are the Neanderthals. And they lived about 400,000 years ago to about 28,000 years ago, and we used to think that they actually went extinct about 40,000 years ago, but some really recent fossil evidence has bumped that up to about 28,000 years ago, which means that we lived in Europe for a considerable amount of time with Homo neanderthal. They had large brains. They are large or larger than ours. As large or larger than ours. They buried their dead and they cared for group members. They made tools from stone and wood. They're really not that different than we are. They have a fairly wide variety all in their cranial structure, although not as wide as, say, Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis, or us even, right? But you can see they existed in the Middle East and Europe, right? They're called Neanderthals because the first fossil was found in the Neander Valley, and this actually is the first skull and the first set of bones that we get. And you can see this is a clearly bipedal organism. You can see that large brain right there. And so this was a very exciting find at the time. It was found in the 1800s, mid-1800s. So how are they different from us, Homo neanderthal? There's actually a lot of ways. On average, they were a little bit shorter. They were a lot stockier. They had asymmetrical arm muscles, right, from left to right, which is interesting. They had a wider pelvis. They had a higher bone density, which possibly allowed them to withstand injuries better, right, because this higher bone density. They have a elongated skull with a large brain. They have this supraorbital brow ridge that we don't have, so their forehead slopes back more, and they have this wide rib cage that you see here. Okay, and we're going to talk about these things in just a minute. We also found out that they have bulges, or they appear to have bulges, in the speech-oriented areas of their brains. So true or false, that confirms that they had language. This is actually false. It turns out that you need more than just bulges in the right place of your brain. First of all, you do have to have all of the speech areas, and we can't tell what their brains looked like. We can only see indications of the shape and organization. They do have bulges in the area, Broca's area, which is one of the big speech areas, and Wernicke's area, which is another speech area. But the other thing that's really important, besides a brain that's organized the right way, which we have talked about, is that they have a hyoid bone, and it's this bone right here. and it actually attaches at the top of the throat, and it's what allows your for you to make complex tongue movements, and that's really necessary for complex speech. We also know that they were group hunters, and that seems to be something that requires communication and fairly sophisticated communication. So it's very possible that they had language and even complex language. Okay, now some of these body structures that we see are adaptations to two very important factors in their lives. One, they lived in a very cold climate, and two, they had a high protein requirement because they had such heavy high metabolism bodies, right? So the short, wide thorax, right, that big flaring rib cage, that allowed them to have a greater lung capacity, which would have been needed for the fact that they probably did have higher metabolic rates, and that they had higher physical activities because they would have spent the majority of their time hunting, given the fact that they were ambush hunters and they had to actually get very close to the animal, right? This also, being short and stocky and having the wide chest, reduces the surface area to body mass ratio, which means that they lose less heat, and, right, the stockiness stores heat as well. Okay. They had a large, wide nose, which allowed them to take in more air at a time, but it also allowed them to warm the air better before it reached their lungs. They had a high protein requirement, and we see that they had this asymmetrical arm strength, and that is because they were these ambush hunters that I was talking about. And so they would have pushed the spear with their right arm, and they would have guided it so it gets in the right place, and I'll show you this in class, with their left hand. And so they had much heavier musculature on the right arm than the left. All right, so what about their lifestyle? We know that they were hunters because we found evidence of that. We've seen spear points. They had these thrusting spears. We've got a lot of that. They also had injuries that are similar to bull riding injuries today, the rodeo injuries that you see. And that means that they were in contact, and fairly violent contact, with large animals, which would stand to reason if you were having to hunt up close. We know that they buried their dead, and we think it was pretty intentional because their grave sites had flowers. Oh, by the way, on the whole hunting thing, we also find bones of animals that have been butchered and stuff like that, just as an aside. Okay, so burial, we find grave sites where they are buried with flowers and pollen all around the dead. Interestingly enough, some of these appear to have medicinal value, although we don't know if Neanderthal did anything with that or not. But they are buried the same way. Almost all the Neanderthals we find that have this flower, branch, right, whatever, sort of bed, if you will, are buried in a fetal position, and it seems to be very specific. Okay. We also know that they live, or think that they lived in groups, right? So which of the following would indicate that Neanderthals lived in groups? That villages show huts close together around a central fire pit, community grave sites with families buried together, individuals with healed injuries, or spears and other specialized tools? Well, let me start out by saying that they had no villages and no community grave sites. So those are right out because those only apply to Homo sapiens. A and B are only Homo sapiens. There are no other hominins that we know of. Okay, spears and other specialized tools. Lots of hominins had that. Heidelbergensis had it. Erectus had them. Floresiensis has them. Right. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you live in groups. Okay, but when you find individuals with healed injuries, that is really significant. Okay, so we found this particular skeleton that's been called the Old Man of La Chapelle, and it's got evidence of severe arthritis, and it also has debilitating but healed injuries. And the only way that anyone could survive, and you can see that deterioration, that's arthritis right there, and then you've got some arthritis here, and then you've got some arthritis there. And so this person would have been barely able to walk, in considerable pain, had a broken hip that had healed, had a crushed toe that had healed. These are all things that make it so you cannot hunt, right? And so that means in order for him to get food, someone was feeding him. And so that would indicate that the Neanderthal lived in communities and cared for each other. They cared for their sick and their injured. And that's very similar to us, yeah? So now we have some questions about where did they go, right? They go extinct about 28, 30,000 years ago. And so there are four really big hypotheses. Rapid climate change. Around the time that they go extinct, we've got these big shifts, these big swings in climate, and it actually changes the geography, right? We lose these dense forests that they're hunting in, and it becomes more open spaces. And Neanderthal is adapted to hunting in these forests, and it turns out because of their arm structures, their arm morphology and anatomy, they don't throw well. They can do thrusting spears, but they can't throw spears well. And if you live in an open space, you need to be able to do that. And so this is the most likely hypothesis. The other three are competition, that Homo sapiens outcompeted them, and that's possible, but populations were really small at the time. And so it's not that likely. War with us, right? There are no combat injuries. There are injuries, and they're really serious injuries, but they are not the kind of injuries that we see with fighting or combat, okay? And then interbreeding, the idea that they were absorbed by Homo sapiens. The mitochondrial DNA actually shows that we are two different species, and we split about 400,000 years ago. Okay, and so they split off. We were not around yet, but they split off about 400,000 years ago. Having said that, though, it does appear that we did have contact with them, because modern humans from outside of Africa, right, can have up to 4% of their genes that are Neanderthal genes, right? So if you are specifically of European or Middle Eastern descent, you probably have fairly close to 4% Neanderthal DNA, right? And that's pretty exciting, but it's certainly not enough to say that we absorbed them. Okay. Now, our next group are the Denisovans, and we know nothing about them. The only thing that we know is that they're not Neanderthals and they're not Homo sapiens. We found a single bone, finger bone, and some teeth, right, in this cave in Siberia, right here in Denisova, which is why they're called the Denisovans. They are much more closely related to the Neanderthals. We did find them with some bracelet and necklace type stuff, although we don't know if that belonged to them or if that belonged to some Homo sapiens or whatever. But their genome is different. They look probably very much like Neanderthal, but they have dark hair, probably dark eyes, and they have dark skin, which is not something you see in Neanderthal. Neanderthal are all light-skinned, typically with lighter hair, right? And so, I mean, they're European, so there's that. And then the next one we want to talk about are the hobbits, Homo floresiensis. They lived from about 100,000 years ago to about 60,000 years ago in Indonesia on the island of Flores. That 60,000 year date, by the way, some of you may have heard 12 to 18,000 years. That is incorrect. Recent evidence, and I mean, I am recording this on the, 2nd of April. I read the article on the 30th of March, so like 3 days ago. So you're getting the latest information if you are listening to this in April of 2016. So that it's really about 60,000 years ago, which means that we did not overlap with them, while we did overlap with Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis. We have overlap with both of them. Okay, so they are very different than us. Right? They're very different from any of the other hominids. And the question becomes why? You can see here is our skull and here's theirs, right? They're about 3 feet tall. And we're going to talk about them later on because they are a very special case. They are an exception to the rules. So we'll come back to them. All right, so let's talk about us, Homo sapiens. We evolved about 200,000 years ago. There's some fossil evidence that dates back to about 195,000 years, but mostly we're looking at mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal DNA, and we'll talk about that in the next unit when we talk about genetics. We evolved in Africa, probably from Homo heidelbergensis, and the evidence of that is that people of African descent have far greater variation than any other population. And by the way, that should say far greater, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to fix it right now. I'll be right back. Okay, all fixed. So they had far greater variation than any other population. We were well established in Europe by about 40,000 years ago, and we were established in Asia as early as 80,000 years ago. Now, interestingly, you can divide Homo sapiens into two subspecies. There's Homo sapiens adultu, and they lived in Africa around 160,000 years ago, and they are a little bit different than all of the rest of Homo sapiens sapiens, right, which is going to be everybody else. So this is a very small population. They are entirely extinct. They were a dead end in our species, but you can see that there's not a whole lot of difference between us, although they still have some of that elongation of the skull that you see in Homo heidelbergensis and Homo neanderthalensis. They still have some brow ridge there that is lost later on. And this is the oldest skull that we find in Europe, and that is what he would have looked like. Okay, so which of the following is the correct list of humans that overlap the existence of Homo sapiens? So take a look at that and see what you think. Well, we know that we overlap with Homo neanderthalensis, that's for sure, okay? We just talked about how we thought that we overlapped with Homo floresiensis, but it turns out that we didn't, right? Homo heidelbergensis evolves, right? They sort of disappear as we appear, okay? Ergaster, we know, is who heidelbergensis evolves from, right? And the Denisovans probably also overlapped with us. And so the answer to this is actually going to be C, right? We know we overlap with Homo erectus, we know we overlap with Homo neanderthalensis, and we know that we think that we're probably contemporary with the Denisovans as well, okay? All right, so where did we live? We lived all over. We were the only species to make it to Australia, although we were not the only species to make it to Indonesia. Homo erectus made it there, and of course that's where we find Homo floresiensis. But we are the only species to have ever gone to every continent, right? And that's kind of interesting. So, fun fact there. All right, so which of the following humans migrated out of Africa? Neanderthal, Heidelbergensis erectus, us, Heidelbergensis Neanderthal, Heidelbergensis us erectus, us Ergaster and erectus. Well, this seems to be a tricky one because we know that a lot of these species were out of Africa, but the question is who started in Africa and left? And we know for sure that that is us. We know for sure that that is Homo heidelbergensis. And we know for sure that that is Homo erectus. So those are the three species, Homo sapiens, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo erectus. So C is the answer to that. And that is the end of this lecture. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them on the Google Doc. That is for this set of video notes, or write them down and ask them at the beginning of class. Thanks very much. Have a good day.